Welcome to Life Mosaic, where we explore the living legacy that connects generations for a lifetime and beyond. Here, life is all inclusive, embracing every moment and memory that shapes who we are. We're not just sharing people's stories, we are celebrating the timeless bond that weaves our lives together, transcending time and space. Join us as we uncover the beautiful mosaic of life.
Welcome to the Life Mosaic podcast. We're your hosts, Rich and Wheezy. And Wheezy, can you believe we're at episode 3 of this brand new endeavor of ours?
I know. We are rolling along with these episodes, Rich. It's just fantastic. And I'm having so much fun. And I hope you, the listeners, are enjoying these podcasts too.
One thing that's going to be in every show that we do, Wheezy, and I hope that we have maybe 3,000 or more of these shows that we
Really?
we could bring to the folks. But anyway, on every show, we're going to have our meme of the week because Wheezy and I just love memes on Instagram that we send to each other.
Oh,
Today's,
a ton a day.
a ton a day, and you're behind, so you've got to get back on there, Wheezy, and catch
I
up.
know, I know. I was telling you earlier, I've been into audiobooks, I get listening to those and it takes up my time. So I apologize, Rich. I'll get
Well,
back on the wagon today.
our real relationship is going to be in trouble.
I know. I know. Memes and reels, that's what we're about.
Memes and reels. Our meme of the week today is the front of a car that shows the inside of the car through the windshield. On the dashboard are 2 trays of uncooked cookies. The caption says, "A heat wave, make cookies." And I bet by the time the driver got off of work, especially if he's in the South, Wheezy, those cookies will be done. What do you think?
Oh my gosh, Rich. This reminds me of my son Aaron. He cracks me up. You know how he heats up his lunch at work?
No.
If he has something hot that he wants for lunch, that's like leftovers or whatever, he takes it and he packs it in foil or something, makes sure that the foil's there. And then he'll like run outside around 10 o'clock in the morning and open it up and put it in the dashboard of his car. So it will heat up. So it'll be ready for when he's ready to eat lunch.
I think that's brilliant.
So, and here in the South, you can do that all year round because your car is going to heat up anyway to hot temperatures. And so summer is in full bloom when we're recording this. And there's a heat wave going on. And today's guest reminds me of the days of when I was young and growing up in Pennsylvania. Riding in the car was so torturing because we didn't have air conditioning in our cars. It was just awful. And so the meme just reminds me of all of this stuff. But Rich, are you, I mean, do you like even remember, are you even old enough to remember riding around in a car without AC?
Well, I'm a little younger than you, Wheezy. Not a huge amount, but I actually do remember, not in our cars, but my grandmother had this old green Chevy Nova from the 70s. And of course, it did not have air conditioning. She lived in the mountains of western North Carolina, but it was still hot in the summer. My uncle owned a dealership, and her car was becoming really unreliable. So he insisted on giving her a brand new car and very generous. He would have got her whatever options she wanted on it, a nice, reliable, small car for her, good on gas and all of that. And she would not accept that gracious gift until he ensured her that that car would not have air conditioning. So she was very old fashioned like that. I think that was just her generation. Her house didn't have air conditioning either, but somehow we managed, and I stayed with her a lot on the weekends when we lived closer to her, and then during school breaks when we moved to Alabama. And we had the fans on, but yeah, no air conditioning, and you just hope that by the end of the day, maybe a little bit of that cold mountain air would come out, and you could go sit on the porch and enjoy a little bit of relief from the heat.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Was your grandma crazy? I mean, to pass up an offer like that. And like you said, I bet you she was from that generation. They just didn't buy the extras. You just make do with what you have and it's good enough, and we don't need any of that fancy trappings. So that's how they would say it, Southern style anyway.
Yeah.
But, I remember those simmering days that there was no relief, and when you would drive somewhere, I lived in the Northeast at this time, and so we too did not have AC in our cars or our homes, but I just remember the dread that when you had to drive somewhere, we had vinyl seats in the car. They were probably black. You crank down the windows because there was no automatic windows. You had the hand rails and you're cranking those suckers down. And I call it the 360 air conditioning. You roll down a couple windows and you go down the highway at 60 miles an hour. So the driving would you would get some cool, but really driving was like sitting in an easy bake oven, you know? And so by the time you reached your destination, you were so hot. Your clothes were like sticking to you and you're like trying to peel them off, peel them away from your skin and everything. You're hot, you're wrinkled. It was awful. You just kind of felt gross all over. But it was probably 1987 before we got a car with any kind of air conditioning in it. And I was married by then.
Yeah, Weezy, I don't really remember that in the cars that we had. I think we always had air conditioning, but anytime you were out in the heat as a kid, your clothes would stick to you. The humidity's terrible, and yeah, you get pretty hot. So I can imagine that that true 360 air conditioning was not nearly as good as what the modern cars had. So at least you survived that time.
That is so true. That is so true, Rich. So I'm thankful for air conditioning, I
Oh
should say.
yes. Thank God for the air conditioning. If you want to check out the meme of the week that we were just talking about, it will be on our show notes page. Just head over to lifemosaic.me and there's an option to click show notes in the menu. So, Wheezy, what is our story this week?
Well, Rich, this week we're doing something different. We have a guest. Yeah, we have a guest.
A
And after you
guest.
hear a
What are we
guest,
trying to be? The morning show or something?
well, we're trying to keep everything mixed up so that, we're not just doing the same old thing each and every week. So we want to keep this interesting. But talking about this heat, after you hear what she used to do, you'll understand why I was talking about the hot cars in the heat of summer. Our guest is Susan Murphy, and she is going to share with us today about being in the forefront of what many of us are thankful for during rush hours, traffic reports, via radio. I can't wait to hear all about this.
Welcome, Susan Murphy, to Life Mosaic. We are so very happy to have you as our first guest on this brand new podcast.
Well, I'm happy to be the inaugural guest. And I love hanging out with you too. And we're going to have a great conversation. And we're going to touch on something that you're right, goes back almost 40 years. And everybody takes for granted traffic reports on the radio and in morning television, evening television too, in the news.
Yeah. Yes, we do. So I want to welcome you, Susan. I'm so glad that you have joined us here on the start of our podcast, Life Mosaic.
So, Susan, would you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Oh my goodness. In 30 words or less, we'll try to do this quickly. I've been a lifetime broadcaster. I started when I was 14 years old, did my first radio commercial kind of accidentally, and realized I could get paid to talk. So from then on, I majored in college in communications, did radio and television, moved on to becoming a news director. I was an afternoon show host in New York for a little while. I produced the morning show, moved over to public television, did a lot of on air work for them. Then, somewhere stretched through there, I became a voice actor, which is still part of my job today. I also worked at Hofstra University. I started as an adjunct instructor teaching the history of radio. And then I was promoted to assistant dean in the School of Communication. And that was 11 years of just sheer joy. I didn't know how much I liked college kids. So that was a lot of fun. And then after that, I soon after that, I moved to North Carolina and continued pretty much just doing voiceover work. And a few years ago, decided, I'm going to do something for reporters that I see on television who may be able to write okay, and maybe they can shoot a story, but when they use their voices, just doesn't match. They didn't get any voice training in college because it's really not done so much anymore. And it wasn't done a whole lot when I was in college either. So I hung out my shingle on LinkedIn, and I'm one of the few broadcast voice coaches in the United States. And in 3 years, I've worked with well over 100 young people, reporters, meteorologists, anchors, and that has become a life's passion. I just love being able to show these young people how best to use their voices because they get a lot of the rest of it right. Might as well sharpen their voices too. So that's what I do.
Wow, that is amazing, Susan. I mean, what a list of accomplishments you have had in your lifetime. So you're talking like early 80s, correct?
Late 70s, actually.
Late 70s.
Yep.
So, having been into the industry for this period of time, you've seen many changes in the industry. I can already tell you have some stories to tell.
And if I told them, then I'd have to kill you. But no, 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 no.
Okay.
A lot of them I can tell, just not all of them. But you're right, the industry has changed so greatly that one of the things I sort of prided myself on was that I could pivot. If I could maybe find a hole, I could see a need, I could, rush in with this idea sort of thing. So whether it was being on the radio and just being a features reporter or working for public television, there were just things I could try because we're a creative group. And I was fortunate enough to work with people who were willing to take chances. And so I'm very fortunate that for more than 40 years, I've been in the same industry. And I don't think most people can say that. But I was always willing to change, to look down the road, to see what might be just around that corner. I took myself off air for public television. It was back in about 2003. It was when high def television had first come out. Now, television prior to that, sure, it always added 10 pounds because of the technology. But when high def came out, oh, yeah, maybe the pounds went away, but the wrinkles and the flyaway hair and the lipstick that's not quite straight, that became very prominent. And I was in my early 40s then. And I said, oh, okay, maybe it's time for me just to do behind the scenes and voiceover work. And you know what? I regret that. I panicked a little bit and I said, nope, I'm not going to be on the air anymore, all because of high def TV. And now it doesn't scare me, but it did back in the day. So
Yeah.
that's what took me off television was high def.
So, Susan, you started with shadow traffic. Was that really your first big break?
Mm, yeah, I think it was. I was in college. I went to Temple University, grew up in Philadelphia. Temple had a great communications program. So I didn't go away to school. I commuted, something else I regret, but that's water under the bridge. So I had two things going for me. I was an intern at KYW News Radio, and they hired me as a part time writer. And then I got hooked up with Shadow Traffic. It was always a friend of a friend kind of thing. And Shadow Traffic at the time, this would have been 1977, was the first traffic reporting service that was available to many or all radio stations in a city. If a radio station had traffic reporting, it was because they paid for a helicopter or a fixed wing aircraft, and they would only, they would get traffic reports from that pilot and it stayed on that radio station. And that's what was going on in major cities and actually had been going on, I've read since back in the 30s, but only in the bigger cities. And in Philadelphia, there was a fellow who owned a truck and car parts company. His name was Michael Lynette. And Michael Lynette was a big fan of CB radio. Remember the CB radio craze back in the
Oh,
mid
yeah.
80s? Sure. And he would be in his silver Mercedes Benz driving around the city with his CB radio, and he would get traffic reports from other drivers. And they all shared it that way, like, oh, avoid the Schuylkill Expressway, coming into City Line Avenue, there's a two-car wreck. And so they passed traffic reports among themselves. And Michael's CB handle was the Silver Shadow. And he had this great idea. Why don't we do this and offer it to radio stations in exchange for commercial inventory? In other words, no cash changed hands. If a radio station wanted to engage with shadow traffic, they would give up 2 to 3 minutes in commercial time that shadow traffic then would go sell, and that's how we made money. So Michael got pretty much every radio station in Philadelphia interested in taking shadow traffic reports. Originally, it just did start with a couple of people in cars literally broadcasting over the phone because wealthy people had car phones or had the ability to do that. And then as it caught on and it quickly grew, we then moved into offices and we had little broadcast studios and we had producers who were working on the very earliest computers, TRS-80s. Who remembers a TRS-80? And
Not
they would
me.
type, no, you're younger than me, Wheezy. Um, they would type in the traffic incidents in this TRS-80, and that's how we, in the little broadcast booths, could know what was going on. If we were doing a station in New Jersey, you didn't do, obviously, traffic that was going on in Northeast Philadelphia. So we could break up the reports depending on what station we were on. And it was a huge success. Um, how many reporters were at Shadow Philadelphia? I wasn't the first wave. I was hired in the second wave. So there were probably 7 or 8. They probably started with 4. And then I was part of the expansion in Shadow Philadelphia. And we did have 1 or 2 fixed wing aircraft. That's very expensive because of the fuel. So we did occasionally use fixed wing, and it kind of came and went depending on what the budget was. So between the two, we could do really very up to the minute traffic for listeners on radio stations. And usually we did 2 to 3 traffic reports an hour for about a minute and a half. But it really was groundbreaking and commuters appreciated it greatly. First time they had ever been getting traffic reporting in real time. And it was also the time of the gas crisis in the 70s. Remember that too? So people were very concerned. They were spending so much on gasoline that they really wanted to know the quicker ways or how to avoid an accident, that kind of thing. So that also helped to um, uh, polish Shadow's credentials in terms of being a really useful service.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it was very cutting edge at the time, and involving drivers, I think, was a big deal, and that really set you apart from the other just strictly traffic reports coming from what the helicopter pilot was seeing. I know that you've made it over to the New York office, so tell us how you got your position in the New York office.
Well, at the age of 24, I went to New York as the program director. I was in charge of meeting with radio stations, and I was also in charge of hiring new traffic reporters, which we generally did kids straight out of college, most of them from Seton Hall University, because when we went to New York, we actually headquartered in Union, New Jersey. The rents, the office space in Western New Jersey, or west of the Lincoln Tunnel, was a whole lot cheaper than renting offices in New York City. But everything was done via phone line at the time. So it didn't matter where we were. And at the age of 24, I am meeting with the program directors and sales managers and general managers of most of the radio stations in New York. And I can remember walking into those conference rooms, and these older white gentlemen would look at me askance, like, what is this young lady doing in my conference room? And but I was the program director, and yeah, they knew how to run a radio station, but I knew how to do traffic reports. And it was so new, it's not like there was anybody else. So I quickly became the go-to person for how you get this traffic reporting service on your air. So that was a very interesting time for women in business in radio, and learned a lot of lessons through all of that. And I forget how many radio stations there were in New York at the time. Let's say 25 bigger kind of radio stations. We were probably on 21 of the 25 because everybody wanted to have traffic reports, and all they had to do was give us commercial time.
So with that being said, that you were on these all of these radio stations,
Mhm.
how popular was the program with the listeners?
Interesting you asked that question because it depended on the radio station as to how you, the traffic reporter, fit in. If you were on an all news radio station, you did your traffic report in a minute or so, signed off, and off you went. If you were on a rock and roll radio station, sometimes the morning show team would have fun with you, or you get involved in their falderall and the morning fun. That
Mhm.
sometimes happened. And that happened to me. I was on a radio station in the morning that was WNEW, which was middle of the road, very highly listened to back in the early 80s in New York. And they had some really interesting hosts who had just been in the business forever. And just me being a very young radio personality, what I learned from them in terms of comedic timing, in terms of being your authentic self, in terms of presenting traffic reports in a way that was useful and informative and kept the listeners from tuning out. So we learned as we grew, all of us did. And a lot of the traffic reporting personalities very much did become personalities in New York radio, and some of them went on to other radio stations in the city. I eventually moved over to WOR full time, but it was a wonderful way to for young people to get experience on the air in New York at the tender age of 20, 22, 26.
Wow.
And it was a time, it'll never be repeated. And I think we understood how groundbreaking we were for the time, but looking back, you realize it was much bigger than that. And Shadow hasn't existed since maybe 2010 because it was bought out several times. And now there are only about two companies in the United States that are putting out traffic reporting uh, programs or reporters around the country. And it's now in pretty much every large and small town. There's always room for a traffic report because if you're going to work or coming home, what are you doing? You're listening to the radio.
Yeah, for
Still
sure.
very, very useful.
So you were on the radio, but would you have been a person that people might have recognized?
After a little while, yes. Now, the nice thing about being on radio is that you're anonymous. Nobody knows what you look like. However, I had been recognized for my voice, which just was flipping crazy. I was in a card store. And you know how in card stores you had these big racks of cards and you could be on one side and then different cards are on the other side. And I think I was with my daughter and we were talking and a woman comes around the other side of the card rack, and she looks at me and she says, "I'm sorry, but are you Susan Murphy?" And I said, "Well, why, yes. How did you know?" And she said, "Well, I recognized your voice from radio." So I was a traffic reporter and I had my own radio stations in the morning. I had 4 or 5 radio stations that I specifically did, but I was very smart. I wasn't on the air in the afternoon, but I would fill in for any traffic reporter who was sick or was on vacation. So was I heard on every radio station in New York? At one point or another, yes, I was. So certainly the name Susan Murphy was a name that a lot of people came to know. And I learned several years later, like many, many several years later, that at the time in the early 1980s, I had the highest Q score of any radio personality in New York. And a Q score is where they get in focus groups or they do surveys and they'll say either, list the radio personalities you know, or do any of these names on this list, do you know these people from their work on the radio? And lo and behold, for about 2 years, I was number one in the city. It's a good thing I didn't know it then, or I'd have a huge head. But
Well, let's touch you now. I'm glad that I know you.
oh, it was not that big a deal, Wheezy. Really, it was not that big a deal.
Well,
But
it sounds like a huge deal to me.
I just was everywhere, and oddly, I would get commercial work from it. I got all kinds of opportunities to do things because I was a personality on at least 4 or 5 radio stations, and my name was well known throughout the city. That's how I got my agent, and I would go out on, commercial bookings back in quite literally, even in the early 80s. It was very much Mad Men. You would go to the ad agency, you would sit in a room waiting to be called in, and you'd be looking around and you'd recognize women you remember seeing on TV commercials, and then they would call you in and they'd give you the script, and you maybe got to do it 2 or 3 times, and they would literally say, "Don't call us, we'll call you." I mean, I had that said to me. It really was Mad Men back in the days. Yeah.
Wow.
Uh, I only think I booked 2 spots in New York. I mean, I was up against the cream of the crop, but I was also a younger voice at the time, so that played to my favor, but I think I booked only 2 commercials. That's okay, I booked 2.
That you booked too. So back to shadow traffic.
Mhm.
This is just so interesting. So you may have already answered this, but I'm going to ask it again. So this was such a frontier time. What impact did the frontier of traffic reporting have on the industry that has grown to what we see today?
Well, that's a great question. And again, I don't think we understood how big it would be 10 and 15 years later, but the fact that it wasn't just a matter of being able to tell commuters that if you're trying to get across the George Washington Bridge, there would be a 30-minute wait because of an accident on the Cross Bronx or whatever. What we like to think we did was we could at least answer your frustration. If you were sitting in traffic that you didn't normally sit in, and you could turn around to a radio station or a traffic report, they might be able to tell you that half a mile away there was a 3-car accident. And so at least you knew why you were sitting in that backup. It was also very helpful to police departments who we checked in with all the time, and they would check in with us. They would call and say, Route 80 in New Jersey out in Patterson, 2-car accident on the westbound side at exit 40. So it was a very symbiotic relationship with law enforcement. Um, so it was very useful, and commuters came to expect it. So eventually, some of the shadow people were actually doing traffic reporting for TV stations in their morning shows. And I remember at least one of them stationed himself at the TV station in the city and would do all the traffic reports for them. And then when he wasn't on the air, he'd be on the phone doing the traffic reports for the radio stations.
Oh,
So
wow.
for a while, we shared resources, TV and radio. But then eventually, traffic reporting became its own job for television stations, and it still is today. Again, because people want to know where the hot spots are, where the delays are going to be. So it literally created a job for people in the broadcast industry, both radio and television. And then after Shadow, we went Shadow Philadelphia, Shadow New York, Shadow Chicago was third, and then it went to all kinds of other stations. I had
Oh,
left
wow.
by then, but it went nationwide, quite literally. Dallas, Boston. I mean, I don't remember exactly, but now it's one big company where they have
Oh,
traffic reporters
time.
stationed
That's
around.
the next question.
Oh, sorry.
I'm gonna cut you there.
Okay.
Sorry.
But
Um,
Wheezy's the producer, as you can tell.
I try to keep it in line. Um,
So go
but
into
before
the
wait a minute, I just want to ask her one more thing because there's one thing that you and I talked about in your story that I thought was funny was it, you know, people could time their commute home, but did it also affected trains too, didn't it? And wives could decide on what time to start dinner or to if they were going to have to hold dinner, different things like that. Can you talk about that?
And that's the way the world was back then, you know? Working women were just getting into the workforce. Many of them were home. They were waiting on dad. They were waiting on trains to come in. And yes, we did traffic and transit when those delays were made available to us. And again, we would work with all the Metro North and Long Island Railroad and New Jersey Transit. And then we eventually added airport delays, particularly for holiday traveling, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, if it moved on a road, a railway, or a runway, shadow traffic covered it. And we
The
had all
shadow
kinds of people
knows.
looking for us, right? Well, and that was one of our early taglines, you know, shadow traffic. Why do you call yourselves shadow traffic? Well, it goes back to Michael Annette and the Silver Shadow. But then, oh yeah, we used to take advantage of, oh, you know, who knows traffic? The shadow knows. It was such a big deal back in
It
1980.
sounds like you had fun.
And we did, because it was a camaraderie of people who, you know, we shared the good times, the bad times, filled in for each other. We had a softball team. We occasionally played radio stations in New York City, our softball team versus theirs. So it was a really unusual, wonderful time to be in the broadcast industry. And our general manager at Shadow Traffic New York was the inimitable Fred Feldman, who used to fly the traffic reporting helicopter for WOR for, I think it was 6 or 12 years, I forget. Um, and so he came to us and was our general manager, and he was very useful in getting skeptical radio stations to sign on for this. Now, what are you giving us again? And what do you want for it? It was literally that new. Groundbreaking, and you're right, it was pioneering. And I've never thought of using the word pioneering, Wheezy, but that's exactly what we did.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Rich, now you can ask your question.
Uh, it, hang on a minute. Wheezy knows with my allergies, I have to cough every now and again. Susan, is shadow traffic still in business today?
Technically, no. The name Shadow was swallowed up the first time, I think it was 2008, 2009, by a company called Metro Traffic. And then they kind of branded themselves for a little while as Shadow Metro or Metro Shadow. And then Westwood One took it over, and then iHeart Media took it over, and I think it's still with iHeart Media. So Shadow technically lasted from what, 1979 to about 2009. And I think last December was our 44th anniversary. We started December 5th, 1979 in New York. And every year somebody in our Facebook groups and whatever points out that, oh, it's our anniversary again. And next year, this December will be 45 years that traffic reporting has been a staple for radio stations beginning in Philadelphia and New York.
Susan, I have one last question before we wrap up.
Mhm.
Um, so with this being so pioneering and it's coming up on a big anniversary, has anybody ever done a like a little documentary or a story that people could look for to learn more about shadow traffic?
Certainly in the 1980, 81, even into 1982, yes, the New York Times did a big piece on us. Several of the TV stations did one. In fact, I think it was, I don't remember whether CBS or ABC New York did a wonderful, like, long form piece. I think it was 4 minutes long, where they came out with camera crews and they interviewed us and they went up with our pilots and out with our drivers. And um, that is on YouTube somewhere. You would just have to Google shadow traffic New York and then put in like 1980, and it'll come up. And having recently seen it, it is amazing to me how young we were and how the cars, the city, the buildings, they just look so old. And yet at the time, we didn't think it was old. We thought we were hot stuff, and that happens, I guess, in every generation as the 2 or 3 or 4 generations come up behind us. But um, it's a wonderful beginning to a career um, that I wouldn't trade for the world. Traffic reporting teaches you how to ad lib, teaches you how to turn on a dime, teaches you a lot about communication, gives you skills that you can't possibly learn anywhere else except by doing something so that changes not just day to day, but literally minute to minute. And you'd have to react
Yeah.
to those changes. When, it was um, a really horrific traffic accident or something, roads that would buckle, or there were times that we would be the first on the scene of some major news stories in New York City and in Philadelphia too, because we could get there fast enough.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Susan, that is just fantastic. And listeners, I will try to have that information up on listeners, I'll try to have that information up on our show notes. I don't even need to say that. Um, Rich, is there anything else you want to ask her before I do the thank her for being here?
No, we can thank her and then move into toss into my radio promo.
Okay. Well, Susan, this was just a fascinating story. I could just sit here and listen to this all day long,
I
but
could
I
talk
know
about it
you
all day
have
long.
things to do.
Well, anytime you want to talk about this or anything else in broadcast, from back in the day, I'm your girl.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing your remarkable history
Thank you.
and this pioneering traffic reports as we know them today. It's just amazing how you were part of that. And we just really enjoyed having you here as
Yes,
our
we
guest.
did.
You guys are great to have conversation with. I'll come back anytime.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Susan.
Thanks,
Thank
Susan.
you.
Rich, this ties right in with your radio show. Talking to people, sharing information, and playing music we can sing along to while driving. What kind of music are you serving up this week?
Well, it definitely reminded me of the radio station and all the neat things that she did. I kind of wish we had room for some traffic reporting like she has, but our station is a community radio station of talk and music shows. If you are stuck in traffic in Savannah, Georgia, the cool hits of the 90s can help make your drive easier. So tune into 90s Vibes every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern for a great mix of popular music and maybe a few 90s songs that you might have not heard of. And you don't have to be in Savannah to tune in. That is what's so great about WRUU. We are on 107.5 FM in Savannah, but anywhere you have internet, you can live stream us at WRUU.org. I do come on at the time they call drive time, so there are folks in Savannah maybe they're listening to my show that are just like what Susan described. They're stuck in traffic and trying to get on home. So hopefully my show gives them a little bit of relief, and hopefully they have air conditioning too. But
Really?
I also have a Sunday show at noon. It's a mix of contemporary and traditional worship music. That is Songs of Worship, Sunday at noon Eastern. And more information can be found on my social media, which we'll talk about how to find us here in just a few minutes.
Susan, thanks so much for sharing your remarkable history and with the pioneering the traffic the reports as we know them today.
Speaking of being stuck, Wheezy knows that I am bad at getting stuck in my shell. She talks about folks like me that are turtles, and not the cool Ninja Turtles, but those that are afraid to be on camera. And I know, Wheezy, eventually we're going to have this podcast available on video, but she's helping this turtle take little baby steps right now. And Wheezy, your job is to help people like me that are stuck in their shells or maybe just don't know how to really tell their story, and they want to leave a living legacy to share with their family and in generations to come. So, Wheezy, how can folks learn more about your company that helps folks leave a living legacy for their family?
Thanks, Rich. This is how I help people tell their stories. I like to get into their heads, into the imagination, so they tell the story using imagination. So just imagine you're sitting in New York City traffic and you hear Susan's voice coming out of the radio, giving help to the stressed drivers and possibly some of those family members that are waiting at home that want to put dinner on the table, that with these traffic reports coming to better help plan the commutes and most importantly dinner. This would be an example of how I might help you tell your story. So if you go over to livinglegacywithweezy.com, you can see how I can guide you to tell your stories.
And that's great that you help people like that. I think of a family that I've lost. My grandfathers that I was too young to really get to know. And what a wonderful gift it would have been if they could have left a video so I could have seen what they looked like and talked like. I even asked my dad the other day, I'm like, I've got to see if any of the family has a picture of your father, of my grandfather. I don't even know what he looks like. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, so to have a living legacy video to pass down is great. So please do check that out, livinglegacywithweezy.com. Thank you for joining us on today's episode. A special thanks again to Susan for being our very first interview, and we plan to have more interviews in the future. She left us with some of the pieces of mosaic that made up her life mosaic. Please like, subscribe, and share this podcast. We're available on all major platforms from Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon, and the list goes on. Go to lifemosaic.me to see how you can find us on your favorite podcast app. And you can just listen too. If you just want to listen to us on the web, lifemosaic.me has you covered there too. I can be found on Facebook, Instagram at Rich on the Air. That's all one word, Rich on the Air. And Wheezy, how can folks find you?
Well, Rich, they can find me easily with my handle, LLW Wheezy, on Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly of Twitter. Hey, I want to remind you, if you'd like to view that video, that YouTube video that Susan mentioned, it's going to be on our show note page on our website. That's lifemosaic.me under the show notes tab.
And
Right, or
Wheezy, it's
something.
been such a pleasure to have had Susan with us for the interview. I just thought that was so interesting, being a radio personality and knowing how traffic reports started and how cutting edge they were back then.
I really enjoyed it a lot too, Rich, and I hope you all enjoyed hearing about the birth of traffic reporting. It was just an honor to have Susan on here as a guest.
I had a great time, Wheezy, with you as always, and also having our guests today. And I am so happy that we will continue to come to you each week here on Life Mosaic. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of Life Mosaic. Go to our website, lifemosaic.me, to sign up and be notified when the podcast episodes will air. Also, we have the show note option that we've talked about in the menu of our website, again at lifemosaic.me, where we will recap the episodes, have links like Wheezy was talking about, and give you visuals to go along with our episodes. We also will have more ways for you to connect soon.